Chapter 13. Cooperation. Capitalist production only really begins, as we have already seen, when each individual capital simultaneously employs a comparatively large number of workers, and when, as a result, the labor process is carried on an extensive scale and yields relatively large quantities of products. A large number of workers working together at the same time in one place, or if you like, in the same field of labor, in order to produce the same sort of commodity under the command of the same capitalist, constitutes the starting point of capitalist production. This is true both historically and conceptually. With regard to the mode of production itself, manufacture can hardly be distinguished, in its earliest stages, from the handicraft trades of the guilds, except by the greater number of workers simultaneously employed by the same individual capital. It is merely an enlargement of the workshop of the master craftsmen of the guilds. At first, then, the difference is purely quantitative. We have shown that the surplus value produced by a given capital is equal to the surplus value produced by each worker multiplied by the number of workers simultaneously employed. The number of workers does not in itself affect either the rate of surplus value or the degree of exploitation of labor power, and with regard to the production of commodity values in general, every qualitative alteration in the labor process appears to be irrelevant. If a working day of 12 hours is objectified in 6 shillings, 1,200 working days of 12 hours will be objectified in 1,200 times 6 shillings. In one case, 12 times 1,200 working hours are incorporated in the products, and in the other case, 12 working hours. In the production of value, a number of workers merely rank as so many individual workers, and it therefore makes no difference in the value produced, whether the 1,200 men work separately or united under the command of one capitalist. Nevertheless, within certain limits, a modification does take place. The labor objectified in value is labor of an average social quality. It is an expression of average labor power. Any average magnitude, however, is merely the average of a number of separate magnitudes, all of one kind, but differing in quantity. In every industry, each individual worker differs from the average worker. These individual differences, or errors as they are called in mathematics, compensate each other and vanish whenever a certain minimum number of workers are employed together. Edmund Burke, that famous sophist and sycophant, goes so far as to make the following assertion, based on his practical observations as a farmer, that in so small a plantation as that of 5 farm laborers, all individual differences in the labor vanish, and that consequently any given 5 adult farm laborers taken together will do as much work in the same time as any other 5. But however that may be, it is clear that the collective working day of a large number of workers employed simultaneously, divided by the number of these workers, gives one day of average social labor. For example, let the working day of each individual be 12 hours. Then the collective working day of 12 men simultaneously employed consists of 144 hours. And although the labor of each of the dozen men may diverge more or less from the average social labor, each of them requiring a different amount of time for the same operation, the working day of everyone possesses the qualities of an average social working day, because it forms 1/12 of the collective working day of 144 hours. From the point of view of the capitalist who employs these 12 men, the working day is that of the whole dozen. Each individual man's day is an adequate part of the collective working day, no matter whether the 12 men help each other in their work, or whether the connection between their operations consists merely in the fact that the men are all working for the same capitalists. But if the 12 men are employed in 6 pairs, by 6 different small masters, it'll be entirely a matter of chance whether each of these masters produces the same value, and consequently whether he secures the general rate of surplus value. Divergences would occur in individual cases. If one worker required considerably more time for the production of a commodity than was socially necessary, the duration of necessary labor time would, in his case, diverge significantly from the labor time socially necessary, the average labor time. His labor would therefore not count as average labor, and his labor power would not count as average labor power. It would either be unsaleable or saleable only at less than the average value of labor power. A fixed minimum of efficiency in all labor is therefore assumed, and we shall see later on that capitalist production provides the means of fixing this minimum. Nevertheless, this minimum diverges from the average, although on the other hand the capitalist has to pay the average value of labor power. Of the small 6 masters, then, one would squeeze out more than the average rate of surplus value, another less. The inequalities would cancel out for the society as a whole, but not for the individual masters. The law of valorization, therefore, comes fully into its own for the individual producer only when he produces as a capitalist and employs a number of workers simultaneously, i.e., when from the outset he sets in motion labor of a socially average character. Even without an alteration in the method of work, the simultaneous employment of a large number of workers produces a revolution in the objective conditions of the labor process. The buildings where the workers actually work, the storehouses for the raw material, the implements and utensils they use simultaneously or in turns, in short, a portion of the means of production, are now consumed jointly in the labor process. On the one hand, the exchange value of these means of production is not increased, for the exchange value of a commodity is not raised by any increase in the exploitation of its use value. On the other hand, they are used in common, and therefore on a larger scale than before. A room where 20 weavers work at 20 looms must be larger than the room of a single weaver with 2 assistants. But it costs less labor to build one workshop for 20 persons than to build 10 to accommodate 2 weavers each. Thus, the value of means of production concentrated for use in common, on a large scale, does not increase in direct proportion to their extent and useful effect. When consumed in common, they give up a smaller part of their value to each single product, partly because the total value they part with is spread over a greater number of products, and partly because their value, although it is greater in absolute terms, is relatively less, looked at from the point of view of their sphere of action, than the value of the separate means of production. Owing to this, the value of a part of the constant capital falls, and in proportion to the size of the fall, the total value of the commodity also falls. The effect is the same as if the means of production had cost less. This economy, in the application of the means of production, arises entirely out of their joint consumption in the labor process by many workers. Moreover, this character of being necessary conditions of social labor, a character that distinguishes them from the dispersed and relatively more costly means of production of isolated independent workers or small masters, is maintained even when the numerous workers assembled together do not assist each other but merely work side by side. A portion of the instruments of labor acquires this social character before the labor process itself does so. Economy in the use of means of production has to be considered from 2 points of view. Firstly, insofar as it cheapens commodities and thereby brings about a fall in the value of labor power. Secondly, insofar as it alters the ratio of surplus value to the total capital advanced, i.e. to the sum of the values of its constant and variable components. The latter aspect will not be considered until the first section of Volume 3 of this work. In order that we may treat them in their proper context, many other points relevant here have also been relegated to the third volume. The particular course taken by our analysis forces this tearing apart of the object under investigation. This corresponds also to the spirit of capitalist production. Here, the worker finds the instruments of labor existing independently of him as another man's property. Hence, economy in their use appears, from his standpoint, to be a separate operation, one that does not concern him and therefore has no connection with the methods by which his own personal productivity is increased. When numerous workers work together side by side in accordance with a plan, whether in the same process or in different but connected processes, this form of labor is called cooperation. Just as the offensive power of a squadron or cavalry, or the defensive power of an infantry regiment, is essentially different from the sum of the offensive or defensive powers of the individual soldiers taken separately, so the sum total of the mechanical forces exerted by isolated workers differs from the social force that is developed when many hands cooperate in the same undivided operation, such as raising a heavy weight, turning a winch, or getting an obstacle out of the way. In such cases, the effect of the combined labor could either not be produced at all by isolated individual labor, or it could be produced only by a great expenditure of time, or on a very dwarf-like scale. Not only do we have here an increase in the productive power of the individual by means of cooperation, but the creation of a new productive power which is intrinsically a collective one. Apart from the new power that arises from the fusion of many forces into a single force, mere social contact begets in most industries a rivalry and stimulation of the animal spirits, which heightens the efficiency of each individual worker. This is why a dozen people working together will produce far more in their collective day of 144 hours than 12 isolated men, each working for 12 hours, and far more than one man who works 12 days in succession. This originates from the fact that man, if not, as Aristotle thought, a political animal, is at all events a social animal. Although a number of men may be simultaneously occupied together on the same work, or the same kind of work, the labor of each, as a part of the labor of all, may correspond to a distinct phase of the labor process, and as a result of the system of cooperation, the object of labor passes through the phases of the process more quickly than before. For instance, if a dozen masons place themselves in a row so as to pass stones from the foot of a ladder to its summit, each of them does the same thing, and yet their separate acts form connected parts of one total operation. These acts are particular phases which each stone must go through, and the stones are thus carried up more quickly by the 24 hands of the row of men than they could be if each man went separately up and down the ladder with his load. The object of labor is carried over the same distance in a shorter time. Again, a combination of labor occurs whenever a building, for instance, is taken in hand on different sides simultaneously. although here too the cooperating masons are doing the same work or the same kind of work. The 12 masons, in their collective working day of 144 hours, make much more progress with the building than one mason could make working for 12 days, or 144 hours. The reason for this is that a body of men working together have hands and eyes both in front and behind, and can be said to be, to a certain extent, omnipresent. The various parts of the product come to fruition simultaneously. In the above instances, we stress the point that men do the same work, or the same kind of work, because this, the most simple form of common labor, plays a great part in cooperation, even at its most fully developed stage. If the labor process is complicated, then the sheer number of the cooperators permits the apportionment of various operations to different hands, and consequently their simultaneous performance. The time necessary for the completion of the whole work is thereby shortened. In many industries, there are critical moments, that is to say, periods of time determined by the nature of the labor process itself, during which certain definite results must be obtained. For instance, if a flock of sheep has to be shorn, or a field of wheat has to be cut and harvested, the quantity and quality of the product depends on the initiation and completion of the work at certain definite points in time. In these cases, the time the labor process may take is laid down in advance, just as it is in fishing for herrings. A single person cannot carve a working day of more than, say, 12 hours out of the natural day, but 100 men cooperating can extend the working day to 1,200 hours. The shortness of the time allowed for the work is compensated for by the large mass of labor thrown into the field of production at the decisive moment. The completion of the task within the proper time depends on the simultaneous application of numerous combined working days. The amount of useful effect depends on the number of workers. This number, however, is always smaller than the number of isolated workers that would be required to do the same amount of work in the same period. It is owing to the absence of this kind of cooperation that a great quantity of corn is wasted every year in the western part of the United States, and the same thing happens to cotton in those eastern parts of India where English rule has destroyed the old communities. On the one hand, cooperation allows work to be carried on over a large area. For certain labor processes, therefore, it is required simply by the physical constitution of the object of labor. Examples of this are the draining of marshes, the construction of dikes, irrigation, and the building of canals, roads, and railways. On the other hand, while extending the scale of production, it renders possible a relative contraction of its arena. This simultaneous restriction of space and extension of effectiveness, which allows a large number of incidental expenses, faux frais, to be spared, results from the massing together of workers and of various labor processes, and from the concentration of the means of production. The combined working day produces a greater quantity of use values than an equal sum of isolated working days, and consequently diminishes the labor time necessary for the production of a given useful effect. Whether the combined working day, in a given case, acquires this increased productivity because it heightens the mechanical force of labor, or extends its sphere of action over a greater space, or contracts the field of production relatively to the scale of production, or at the critical moment sets large masses of labor to work, or excites rivalry between individuals and raises their animal spirits, or impresses on the similar operations carried on by a number of men the stamp of continuity and many-sidedness, or performs different operations simultaneously, or economizes the means of production by use in common, or lends to the individual labor the character of average social labor, whichever of these cases is the cause of the increase, the special productive power of the combined working day is, under all circumstances, the social productive power of labor, or the productive power of social labor. This power arises from cooperation itself. When the worker cooperates in a planned way with others, he strips off the fetters of his individuality and develops the capabilities of his species. As a general rule, workers cannot cooperate without being brought together. Their assembly in one place is a necessary condition for their cooperation. Hence, wage laborers cannot cooperate unless they are employed simultaneously by the same capital, the same capitalist, and therefore unless their labor powers are bought simultaneously by him. The total value of these labor powers, or the amount of the wages of these workers for a day or a week, as the case may be, must be ready in the pocket of the capitalist before the workers themselves are ready to start the process of production. The payment of 300 workers at once, even though only for one day, requires a greater outlay of capital than the payment of a smaller number of men week by week during a whole year. Hence, the number of the workers that cooperate, or the scale of cooperation, depends in the first instance on the amount of capital that the individual capitalist can spare for the purchase of labor power. In other words, on the extent to which a single capitalist has command over the means of subsistence of a number of workers. And as with variable capital, so also with constant capital. For example, the outlay on raw materials is 30 times as great for the capitalist who employs 300 men as it is for each of the 30 capitalists who employ 10 men. The value and quantity of the instruments of labor used in common does not, it is true, increase at the same rate as the number of workers, but it does increase very considerably. Hence, concentration of large masses of the means of production in the hands of individual capitalists is a material condition for the cooperation of wage laborers, and the extent of cooperation, or the scale of production, depends on the extent of this concentration. We saw in a former chapter that a certain minimum amount of capital was necessary in order that the number of workers simultaneously employed, and consequently the amount of surplus value produced, might suffice to liberate the employer himself from manual labor, to convert him from a small master into a capitalist, and thus formally to establish the capital relation. We now see that a certain minimum amount is a material condition for the conversion of numerous isolated and independent processes into one combined social process. We also saw that, at first, the subjection of labor to capital was only a formal result of the fact that the worker, instead of working for himself, works for and consequently under the capitalist. Through the cooperation of numerous wage laborers, the command of capital develops into a requirement for carrying on the labor process itself, into a real condition of production. That a capitalist should command in the field of production is now as indispensable as that a general should command on the field of battle. All directly social or communal labor on a large scale requires, to a greater or lesser degree, a directing authority in order to secure the harmonious cooperation of the activities of individuals and to perform the general functions that have their origin in the motion of the total productive organism as distinguished from the motion of its separate organs. A single violin player is his own conductor. An orchestra requires a separate one. The work of directing, superintending, and adjusting becomes one of the functions of capital, from the moment that the labor under capital's control becomes cooperative. As a specific function of capital, the directing function acquires its own special characteristics. The driving motive and determining purpose of capitalist production is the self-valorization of capital to the greatest possible extent, i.e. the greatest possible production of surplus value, hence the greatest possible exploitation of labor power by the capitalist. As the number of the cooperating workers increases, so too does their resistance to the domination of capital, and necessarily the pressure put on by capital to overcome this resistance. The control exercised by the capitalist is not only a special function arising from the nature of the social labor process and peculiar to that process, but it is, at the same time, a function of the exploitation of a social labor process, and is consequently conditioned by the unavoidable antagonism between the exploiter and the raw material of his exploitation. Similarly, as the means of production extend, the necessity increases for some effective control over the proper application of them, because they confront the wage laborer as the property of another. Moreover, the cooperation of wage laborers is entirely brought about by the capital that employs them. Their unification into one single productive body and the establishment of a connection between their individual functions lies outside their competence. These things are not their own act, but the act of the capital that brings them together and maintains them in that situation. Hence, the interconnection between their various labors confronts them, in the realm of ideas, as a plan drawn up by the capitalist, and in practice, as his authority, as the powerful will of a being outside them who subjects their activity to his purpose. If capitalist direction is thus twofold in content, owing to the twofold nature of the process of production which has to be directed, on the one hand a social labor process for the creation of a product, and on the other hand capital's process of valorization, in form it is purely despotic. As cooperation extends its scale, this despotism develops the forms that are peculiar to it. Just as at first the capitalist is relieved from actual labor as soon as his capital has reached that minimum amount with which capitalist production, properly speaking, first begins, so now he hands over the work of direct and constant supervision of the individual workers and groups of workers to a special kind of wage laborer. An industrial army of workers under the command of a capitalist requires, like a real army, officers, being managers, and NCOs, being foremen and overseers, who command it during the labor process in the name of capital. The work of supervision becomes their established and exclusive function. When comparing the mode of production of isolated peasants or independent artisans with the plantation economy which rests on slavery, political economists count this labor of superintendence as part of the faux frais of production. But when considering the capitalist mode of production, they, on the contrary, identify the function of direction which arises out of the nature of the communal labor process with the function of direction which is made necessary by the capitalist and therefore antagonistic character of that process. It is not because he is a leader of industry that a man is a capitalist. On the contrary, he is a leader of industry because he is a capitalist. The leadership of industry is an attribute of capital, just as in feudal times the functions of general and judge were attributes of landed property. The worker is the owner of his labor power until he has finished bargaining for its sale with the capitalist, and he can sell no more than what he has, i.e. his individual, isolated labor power. This relation between capital and labor is in no way altered by the fact that the capitalist, instead of buying the labor power of one man, buys that of 100, and enters into separate contracts with 100 unconnected men instead of with one. He can set the 100 men to work without letting them cooperate. He pays them the value of 100 independent labor powers, but he does not pay for the combined labor power of the 100. Being independent of each other, the workers are isolated. They enter into relations with the capitalist, but not with each other. Their cooperation only begins with the labor process, but by then they have ceased to belong to themselves. On entering the labor process, they are incorporated into capital. As cooperators, as members of a working organism, they merely form a particular mode of existence of capital. Hence, the productive power developed by the workers socially is the productive power of capital. The socially productive power of labor develops as a free gift to capital whenever the workers are placed under certain conditions, and it is capital which places them under these conditions. Because this power costs capital nothing, while on the other hand it is not developed by the worker until his labor itself belongs to capital, it appears as a power which capital possesses by its nature, a productive power inherent in capital. The colossal effects of simple cooperation are to be seen in the gigantic structures erected by the ancient Asiatics, Egyptians, Etruscans, etc. It has happened in times past that these Oriental states, after supplying the expenses of their civil and military establishments, have found themselves in possession of a surplus which they could apply to the works of magnificence or utility, and in the construction of these, their command over the hands and arms of almost the entire non-agricultural population has produced stupendous monuments which still indicate their power. The teeming valley of the Nile produced food for a swarming non-agricultural population, and this food, belonging to the monarch and the priesthood, afforded the means of erecting the mighty monuments which filled the land. In moving the colossal statues and vast masses of which the transport creates wonder, human labor, almost alone, was prodigally used. The number of the laborers and the concentration of their efforts sufficed. We see mighty coral reefs rising from the depths of the ocean into islands and firm land, yet each individual depositor is puny, weak, and contemptible. The non-agricultural laborers of an Asiatic monarchy have little but their individual bodily exertions to bring to the task, but their number is their strength, and the power of directing these masses gave rise to palaces and temples, the pyramids, and the armies of gigantic statues of which the remains astonish and perplex us. It is that confinement of the revenues which feed them to one or a few hands which makes such undertakings possible. This power of Asiatic and Egyptian kings, of Etruscan theocrats, etc., has in modern society been transferred to the capitalist, whether he appears as an isolated individual or, in the case of joint stock companies, in combination with others. Cooperation in the labor process, such as we find it at the beginning of human civilization among hunting peoples, or say as a predominant feature of the agriculture of Indian communities, is based on the one hand on the common ownership of the conditions of production, and on the other hand on the fact that in those cases the individual has as little torn himself free from the umbilical cord of his tribe or community as a bee has from his hive. Both of these characteristics distinguish this form of cooperation from capitalist cooperation. The sporadic application of cooperation on a large scale in ancient times, in the Middle Ages, and in modern colonies rests on direct relations of domination and servitude, in most cases on slavery. As against this, the capitalist form presupposes from the outset the free wage laborer who sells his labor power to capital. Historically, however, this form is developed in opposition to peasant agriculture and independent handicrafts, whether in guilds or not. From the standpoint of the peasant and the artisan, capitalist cooperation does not appear as a particular historical form of cooperation. Instead, cooperation itself appears as a historical form peculiar to, and specifically distinguishing, the capitalist process of production. Just as the social productive power of labor that is developed by cooperation appears to be the productive power of capital, so cooperation itself, contrasted with the process of production carried on by isolated independent workers, or even by small masters, appears to be a specific form of the capitalist process of production. It is the first change experienced by the actual labor process when subjected to capital. It takes place spontaneously and naturally. The simultaneous employment of a large number of wage laborers in the same labor process, which is a necessary condition for this change, also forms the starting point of capitalist production. This starting point coincides with the birth of capital itself. If then, on the one hand, the capitalist mode of production is a historically necessary condition for the transformation of the labor process into a social process, so on the other hand, this social form of the labor process is a method employed by capital for the more profitable exploitation of labor by increasing its productive power. In its simple shape, as investigated so far, cooperation is a necessary concomitant of all production on a large scale, but it does not, in itself, represent a fixed form characteristic of a particular epoch in the development of the capitalist mode of production. At the most, it appears to do so, and then only approximately, in the handicraft-like beginnings of manufacture, and in that kind of large-scale agriculture which corresponds to the period of manufacture and is distinguished from peasant agriculture mainly by the number of workers simultaneously employed and the mass of means of production concentrated for their use. Simple cooperation has always been, and continues to be, the predominant form in those branches of production in which capital operates on a large scale, but the division of labor and machinery plays only an insignificant part. Cooperation remains the fundamental form of the capitalist mode of production, although in its simple shape it continues to appear as one particular form alongside the more developed ones.